to another episode of SV and Roxi, where we have conversations for the everyday woman by two everyday women. Today we have a special guest with us, Christopher Darden, attorney, professor, and author. And he is also running for LA County Supreme Court. And we're on location today as well. We're at Mardi Gras Tuesdays, one of our favorite Creole spots here in Sherman Oaks, California. So right now I'm going to turn it over to my partner in crime for a proper introduction of Mr. Darden.
Thank you. So yes, today is such an exciting day. We are honored and blessed to have my friend Christopher Darden join us today. And Chris, to start, you have such a breadth of background. If you don't mind, I'd like to start by reading your bio.
Please,
Okay?
thank you.
All right. So as a deputy district attorney, Christopher Darden has worked in the hardcore gang unit and then was the assistant head deputy attorney at the Special Investigators Division, where he investigated criminal activity and corruption by public officials, police officer shootings, and allegations of excessive use of force by police. Christopher Darden's work on the Simpson trial, which a lot of you are familiar with, made the country aware of his passion for victims and their rights to be heard. As a member of the prosecution, Darden emphasized the importance of giving a voice to the victims and their families. So, Chris, you have been doing a lot over the past 30 years.
Yes, I've done a lot. I've been to almost every major university. I was on my way to Europe, actually, to Oxford to speak when the pandemic set. But I've been everywhere, man.
Mm-hmm.
I've been everywhere. Pursuing the law, pursuing my own further education in the law and in justice, and just experiencing life.
What stands out to me, in your bio is your passion for victims and victims' rights. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, beginning in the 1980s, I was a member of the executive board of a small agency located around 88th and Budlong. It was a victims' rights agency. We called it the Loved Ones of Homicide Victims, and we offered burial assistance and therapy to the mothers and family members of homicide victims. And we were there for about 10 years on a shoestring budget. But every weekend, when I went there would be individual and group therapy for mothers. And, it is the most heart-wrenching experience I've had as a lawyer and as a citizen, really, of Los Angeles. The pain and hurt and harm and suffering that family members experience after someone is murdered is just it's immeasurable.
Right.
And it is one of my great accomplishments to have been a participant in the victims' rights movement. And even today, I'm always sensitive about victims. When I teach criminal law and criminal procedure to college students, and when I lecture, I always emphasize the importance of victims. The primary focus needs to be on victims, quite frankly. I say to young men, and I've said to gang members, you can't just kill a person and think you only killed one person. It changes the trajectory of so many other lives that, to take a man's life is one of the most awful things that happen. I'm glad to be a victim's advocate, to be supported by victims advocacy groups. It's just been a blessing for me.
And as a victim's advocate, you've served on both sides, right?
Yes.
As a defense attorney as well as a prosecutor.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about your feelings of the importance of representing all people, that all individuals deserve to have representation, regardless of the crime, regardless of the politics of the case. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, the Fifth and Sixth Amendment guarantee the right to trial, the right to due process. It also guarantees the right to the effective assistance of counsel. The history of this country hasn't always been that everybody got a lawyer in a criminal case, and we know from our own history the number of African Americans lynched imprisoned or placed on the chain gangs without any due process at all. And I'm a very firm believer in the right to counsel. It is what motivates me every time I go to court. And I feel that given my skill set and my experience, for one man, one woman, one person to be charged with a heinous crime and not be properly represented is an abomination. It's just wrong. And I know that we all have our favorites, our loved ones, celebrities, others. And we read the paper, we see the media, we begin to decide who's guilty, who isn't. And after that, we decide, based on our own bias, who deserves a lawyer and who doesn't. Well, the fact of the matter is that everybody deserves a lawyer. And the minute we start toying around with that right, who are going to be the first group of people without lawyers? It's going to be us. This is a right that we as a community need to protect. We need to assert it. Listen, in most criminal cases, if the defendant is guilty, the defendant will be found guilty. No matter what I do, and no matter what any skilled lawyer might do. In most cases, the guilty are going to be convicted. We don't have to choose sides. We don't have to criminalize or vilify the lawyer. We should all stand up for the constitutional rights of a criminal defendant. Because one day it's this guy, next day it might be you.
Well said. Thank you for that.
I want to stick with this point for just a second. So, provided everything that you just said, and you're running for office, how would you, or what would you say to the voter that is looking at it, what you just said from a different perspective in regards to let me back up, the OJ trial, we have generations, we have probably boomers and my generation, Gen X, that feel some type of way about your role in that trial.
Sure.
And then you're moving forward and you have the trial of that you only momentarily were on, defending Eric Holder. And some people feel some sort of way about that as well. Provided that constitutionally everybody, deserves the right to have representation, you still have some people that question just even you taking certain cases. The Ed Buck case, another one. So what would you say to that voter to make them feel confident in selecting you, voting for you when they go to the ballot or when they're filling out their ballot? When they have that question in their head, well, morally, I don't see how he did that. I know what the Constitution said, but morally, I don't see. What would your response be to that voter?
Even Christ visited the condemned, and even Christ believed in justice. Mm-hmm. And there's no conflict. It's not a moral conflict. It is folks sitting back and looking at a situation and not appreciating that it could be them or that it could be someone they love. I will tell you this about Eric Holder. I saw Eric Holder the night before he went to court. Eric Holder was in the throes of a psychiatric event. In my opinion, Eric Holder is extremely and severely mentally ill. Shall we forego representing the mentally ill just because they committed a crime that we're offended by? When people talk to me about Buck or Holder or OJ and how I could play the roles that I play, I want folks to understand that me, criminal law defense attorney, and 100 of my friends who are also defense attorneys defend people that commit murder all the time, every day. Every day. And we all do it for years. You're focused on a celebrity case when there are people being murdered all around you and being defended by us. Mm-hmm. I have worked in cases where children were murdered, where women were murdered, but they weren't famous, these victims. So nobody cared. Nobody cared. You see, I care about the mentally ill. I care about those charged. I think it is a dark day in this country when someone is charged with a crime and can't have the lawyer of their choice or won't be represented. In the 50s and the early 60s, freedom riders went down to the South and they were arrested and detained for days. And the local bar refused to come and represent them many times. Many times the NAACP lawyers went down south to represent these folks, sometimes lawyers from the Communist Party, because the local bar wouldn't represent them. That is the history surrounding the Sixth Amendment. Unpopular defendants left to rot on the vine because we don't like what they stand for. I stand for justice, and people have to understand that if I'm the judge, no matter who you are, and no matter what you've been accused of, in my courtroom, you're going to be treated with dignity, and you're going to be represented by a good lawyer. And you have a right to a defense, and you have a right to due process, and you have a right to a fair trial. And I am going to ensure that those rights are honored. Would we want anything less from a judge?
Yeah, thank you. And, for your run for the LA Superior Court judge, I'm curious, what is the representation right now of ethnic judges in Los Angeles County?
Well, I will say that the percentage of black judges in LA County is about 8%. It's about 8%. And, I hear some folks talk about diversity. I hear women candidates talk about diversity. Well, there's still the issue of diversity for African Americans. I mean, 30% of the prison inmates in this country are African American. 8% of the judges in this county are African American. So there's still a huge diversity issue that we have to address in terms of us and our community and our representation on the bench. But I'm not here for affirmative action. I'm not here asking to be elected because I'm black or just because I'm black. I'm here asking folks to vote for me because of 44 years of experience, because I've tried almost 200 jury trials, because I was a prosecutor, a criminal law defense attorney, because I was a law school professor, because of my experience and because of my passion for the law and for justice.
So with that, what would be some of the key imperatives or the impact that you think you would make as the LA Superior Court judge?
Well, I think one impact I would make is by me just being in the room when policy is made. Understand that, the court is a government entity unto itself, and it enacts policies. It has its own procedures. Certainly there are procedures described in the penal code, for instance, but every court functions differently. I want to make sure that our court follows and addresses the issue of reform. I'd like to see our court expand mental health courts and expand mental health awareness within the system. I think the system ought to incorporate within it social workers, psychiatric technicians, and other people who can help detect and address the issue of mental illness, which I see all the time in court. I see defendants come out of the lockup who are clearly having mental health issues, and I don't believe that they're being fully addressed. I don't believe the county jail, where we are housing the mentally ill, is equipped to address the issue of mental illness. And I also think that we should, as a court, be providing services or at least referring defendants to social services so that they can address some of their issues. Homelessness is a factor. I represented a client a few years ago, and he wanted to go to jail longer than what the prosecutor was offering him. You know why? He said he had no place to go. And he said he knew he'd get 3 square meals and medical care. That is where we are. That is where we are. And if we're going to use the criminal justice system to house the mentally ill, apparently we are, because we have been, we need to offer more services. And I will say this too. I think we need to start paying attention to those who are before the court in criminal cases, but who grew up in foster care. I think that there is a correlation between some criminality for some folks and having grown up in foster care. So, and folks need to understand, I'm all for sending violent offenders away and people who prey on our community and cause suffering and irreparable harm to our community. I'm an advocate for community safety, but I think justice is supposed to take into consideration all of those factors. But also, let's help and rehabilitate folks when we can. Let's give those who deserve a second chance, who can prove they deserve a second chance, that second chance.
Those are all very good points. My background is in psychology. My degrees are in psychology, so I'm so glad that you brought up those points. I've been, especially on the gun issue, I've been saying those two areas need to marry and have conversations. We need counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists in the conversation about gun laws, because people aren't really understanding, the capacity of a person's brain until they're 25 and above. So these conversations are very, very important. So I'm so glad that you brought up mental health. I also want to ask you about, in the courtroom, representation on the bench, but what about, because this is a conversation within the African American community right now, a hot topic, more people showing up to serve for jury duty. In your history in the courtroom, what have you seen? What have been your experiences? And what are your thoughts about more people let's not avoid jury duty, let's show up and actually serve on the jury?
Well, if you want justice, if you believe in it, then you have to show it. Because the only way to ensure justice is to be present. Just this past December, I was about to try a 50-count robbery, assault with a deadly weapon case. 50 counts. It was going to be a 6-week trial. We began to select the jury. The court sent for 85 potential jurors. 85 folks came in. One African American. 85 potential jurors, one African American. That one African American male turned out to be an FBI agent. Okay, so from a defense perspective, he was not a suitable juror. But can you imagine, when we think of juries and what they ought to consist of, we always say to ourselves, think that a jury should consist of our peers, a jury of our peers. Well, that's not what we're getting in Los Angeles, and we certainly aren't getting that in the downtown Los Angeles courthouse. But we have to be present. We have to be present if we want to ensure justice. Because I've tried cases where, many times, where there were no African American jurors on the jury at all, including homicides. And there was a sense of unfairness about that. Not to say that Black jurors or African American jurors are going to vote more favorable for the defendant, because we as a community believe in accountability too. We believe in the law too. We believe in community safety too. And so, it's never a guarantee that anything favorable is going to come of the case from a defense attorney perspective, just because we have Black jurors. But it is, in a sense, an entitlement, a right that a criminal defendant has. A right to a jury comprised of a cross-section of the community. But we keep getting cross-sectioned out. And it's because we're not showing up. And it's because we're trying to figure out a way, any way possible, to avoid jury service. Folks have got to come downtown. Don't complain about the system. Don't complain about Tory Lanez. Don't complain about anything you see or hear or read about with the court system when you refuse to participate. I need you. I need you.
Well, I'd like to talk more about your work as an author, fiction and nonfiction. So, what are some of your favorite books that you have produced?
Well, in the 90s and up to about 2005, 2006, I wrote, with a friend of mine, four novels. And after the O.J. Simpson trial, I wrote an autobiography called In Contempt. In Contempt was a #1 New York Times bestseller, stayed on the bestseller list for about 30 weeks in hardback and in paperback. And I always dreamed that one day our kids would read In Contempt as part of their Black history list of books to read. I haven't seen any college or school include In Contempt, but I hope one day history will look back on it and find that it has some historical value. But one of the books that I wrote was called The Trials of Nikki Hill, and it was a crime drama. The primary character is a Black woman who was a prosecutor. She lived in Ladera Heights. She frequented all of the places we do, the Crenshaw area, and she was very much a part of the community, but she was also a prosecutor. And that book, some years ago, was almost made into a movie. It was so close to being made into a movie that you wouldn't believe it. But management changed. There was one particular studio that had bought the rights to it, and it never happened. So The Trials of Nikki Hill is my favorite in terms of fiction, and In Contempt for nonfiction.
So 2 books for us to add and our viewers to add to their reading list.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. I have one more question for you, then I'm going to give you something.
Okay.
From a prosecutor standpoint, we saw this with Kamala Harris when she was running for office. People having an issue with her being a prosecutor in the past.
Right.
Can you speak to that a little bit in regards to what you're trying to do moving forward in the capacity of the judge?
Well, I would say this, that the person I'm running against is a prosecutor right now. So,
Okay.
So if you're anti-prosecutors, then you really need to vote for me.
Okay.
But, listen, we are so often the victims of crime, and our communities are so often plagued by crime, such that I think it's important that we have Black prosecutors. I think it's important that we have Black prosecutors who understand our culture, and I think it's important that we have Black prosecutors in the courtroom because of their cultural sensitivity. When I was a young prosecutor, there was an occasion where I dismissed the case. A young man was being held in the Beverly Hills courthouse for petty theft. The bailiff leaned over to me and said, "Hey, we just stopped some guy from raping this kid in a lockup." And he was a little hysterical, traumatized, and I dismissed the case. Caught a lot of flack for that because it violated the DA's policy in terms of dismissing cases. Being sexually assaulted wasn't a proper excuse for dismissal. But I thought he suffered enough. And if there was going to be a lesson learned, if he was going to change his ways, I hoped that might be the trigger for that. But I do think that we need people who understand the language, who know what it's like. For a lot of our kids, just living where they live and having to function there every day provides its own form of PTSD, its own form of trauma. And we need people who are sensitive to that trauma.
So I want to give you this. During the OJ trial, I'm going to date myself as well, I watched the entire trial. As a matter of fact, my entire office did. I was a probation officer at that time. We watched day in, day out. I remember exactly where I was when the verdict was read. I remember who was around me, and I remember all of it. But also at that time, I was in an abusive relationship. And so that was one of the first times, even though I was a probation officer and cases were coming across my desk, that connection was made when I saw the work that you and your team were doing to hold an abuser accountable. I'm one of those people that has always believed he was guilty. Never doubt in my mind, especially because of the experience I was in. So I do want to give you a thank you for doing that work. I know at the top we talked about working with victims, advocates for victims and things like that. I'm one of those people that was watching from Houston that you had no idea was watching. So I want to thank you for doing that work.
Well, one of the few good things that came out of the Simpson case was raising the awareness about social injustice inside the home, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and us finally recognized, including me, that there were thousands and thousands of women living in homes in America, living under the threat of death or great bodily injury every day. And in the system, we had taken that for granted for so many years. And if OJ did anything, he brought awareness to that issue, and he forced the system. He forced every legislature in the country to take domestic abuse seriously. And we finally did.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that. Do you have any?
No, I don't. I'm really grateful for you to be here and all the issues that you discussed. And also just want to recognize that your election is coming up.
Yes.
And if you want to close by saying anything about the district that you're running for LA Superior Court Judge and the timelines for voting.
I would love to.
Okay.
March 5 is the general election. Of course, if you received your ballot, you can vote early and mail it in or drop it off. But at the same time, I hope you know, I'm running for C-130, LA County Superior Court, and I promise you accountability. And I promise you that litigants and defendants and victims that appear before me will be treated with dignity and respect. I promise you that I'm going to make you proud. I'm not supported by a bunch of newspapers. I'm not supported by a bunch of left-wingers or right-wingers. I'm supported by the unions. I'm supported by the working people in this community, the people that really matter. I'm supported by families. Please vote for me on March 5, seat 130, Christopher Darden for LA County Judge. And my website is ChristopherDarden.com.
Thank you so much for being our guest. Absolutely. And
Thank you.
thank you to our audience for tuning in for another episode of SB and Roxi. Conversations for the Everyday Woman by Everyday Women. New episodes every Sunday.